morning. I'm Christine Mallinson. I am thrilled to be able to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Ann Charity Hudley. Ann and I first started working together in about 2007, and it's been a joy to call her a friend and colleague ever since. When we started working together, both of us were fairly newly minted assistant professors, and we jumped right in to address the question that was pressing for both of us, which was how can we use linguistics to address issues of racial and educational equity and inclusion? But Ann's work has always touched on these issues from the beginning of her career and her life. Her background growing up in the U.S. South and witnessing the long history of racial segregation and economic and social disparities there has informed her understanding of social justice and of education as being a fundamental opportunity for equality. Ann went on to obtain her BA and MA in linguistics at Harvard before heading to the University of Pennsylvania, where she worked with Bill LaBeouf, and obtained her PhD in 1998. Her dissertation, Dialect Variation in School Settings Among African American Children of Low Socioeconomic Status, was based on fieldwork data that was collected right here in New Orleans, hence the dedication of her plenary as being for the children of the 9th Ward circa 2005. Ann's position, which has always run throughout her work, is that as academics, our overarching goal must be to expand access, diversity, and inclusion wherever we can in education and in society. Without giving y'all a whole bunch of spoilers, some of what you'll learn about in today's plenary is her work in her current position as the North Hall Endowed Chair in the Linguistics of African America and Director of Undergraduate Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she's working on expanding inclusion and access for minority students to undergraduate research opportunities, as well as to the discipline of linguistics and to academia more broadly. You'll also hear about her various National Science Foundation-funded initiatives, including a Research Experiences for Undergraduates partnership between UC system schools and historically Black colleges and universities, which aims to expand access to linguistics for Black undergraduates. This initiative and others that she has led aim to comprehensively address societal challenges with a focus on building inclusive and equitable policies and practices in education, especially for African Americans who, as we all know, are underrepresented both in higher education and in linguistics as a discipline. The initiatives that Ann has helped launch and coordinate are not just projects, but rather are part and parcel of her scholarship. Together, Ann and I co-authored 2 books with Teachers College Press that offer a multicultural, multidisciplinary model of linguistic awareness in K-12 settings, and we're now working together on a 3rd book that extends this model to colleges and universities. Ann has also co-authored a research text for undergraduate students that integrates issues of racial inclusion and equity directly into discussions of academic excellence. In addition to books, Ann has published in several top-tier handbooks and edited volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of Language and Society and the Encyclopedia of Diversity and Social Justice. She has also published in top linguistics and sociolinguistics journals, including Language and Society, Journal of English Linguistics, American Speech, and Language, where we have a forthcoming paper on racial equity in linguistics related to the LSA's first ever statement on race, which you will also hear about in the plenary. Beyond publications, Ann co-founded the Teaching Linguistics section of Language and has also served as its associate editor for several years. She has also served for several years as a member of the LSA's executive committee. Last year in 2019, she received the LSA's Linguistics, Language, and the Public Award, which was awarded for her efforts both to educate K-12 educators about linguistic variation and to mentor students of color within linguistics as a discipline. Ann's work not only theorizes about social problems and analyzes what needs to change, it also takes the next step of showing us how to get that work done right now, as well as what needs to get done next to achieve broad, systematic, and structural impact. Her definition of linguistics privileges action and shows us how we can all concretely use linguistic information every day to build a linguistically equitable educational climate. And with that, I will now turn things over to Ann.
Thank you so much, Christine. You can best describe the relationship between me and Christine is that while I may be the rapper, she is absolutely the DJ. And a DJ ain't shit without a rapper, and a rapper is not shit without a DJ, all right? I am so glad that you all woke up this morning for this, and what I really want to do is dedicate this to the children of the 9th Ward circa 2005, who by the hundreds came and sat with me through interviews and research and observation for months and months. And I have some people here that I'll talk about in a minute representing them. And so I am very grateful for them. And I think that in honor of being in New Orleans, it's so special. I was meant to give this talk last year in New York, but I've been out of work a little bit because of my lung cancer. But I thought it was really special that in the end I was able to give this talk here in New Orleans, because we can do this work together, and we must, in honor of the children of the 9th Ward, do this work. I want to thank in particular Adrienne Dowden, who's here representing the educators of New Orleans. This is a picture from us back in the day. And the American Federation of Teachers. She's here with her daughter, particularly the United Teachers of New Orleans, who in grand Southern style really represented what it means for me to be Southern and Black and of a mixed Creole heritage. When those teachers looked at me when I was finishing my dissertation and said the only thing they needed to say, "We got you." So as we bring this work to linguistics, what we really need to think about is that we, despite, I would say, a good solid 100 years of work and 50 years of work in particular that defines the group of people who are here today, face a persistent and pertinent inclusion challenge. And according to the LSA's own materials, our population of ethnic minorities with advanced degrees in linguistics is so low that none of the federal agencies report data for these groups. So I think this is important for the society, but I think as we grow as a field and a discipline, we really need to think about that particular wording and our relationship with federal agencies and with higher education as a whole, given our responsibilities not just to the discipline, but to society. So some of the things that I've been really honored to be able to talk to many of you about on your home campuses, and that work will continue throughout this year and the next, is what might we ask of ourselves as the LSA and of funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, to really be able to make the inclusion work possible that would need to happen for this data and statistics to change. So for me, what I've been thinking about and talking about quite readily with an increasingly large group of you all is that linguistics needs a diversity and inclusion strategy and an inclusion plan. This grows out of our work on the race statement. It grows out of the need for us to really figure out what an articulated mission might do to serve to empower people from minority groups and formally invite them into linguistics. But most importantly for me, with my work situated around writing to action, it would be a pledge and a call to action to do the work that we know we so desperately need to do. I take this very seriously. The only real good way you can get a Southerner to leave the South is with a really good argument. And so, as people know, in my career, the best argument that I got when I graduated was go home and help your people directly. But Santa Barbara came calling and said, look, we got something we need you to work on the next level of this. And that is that University of California campuses, one by one, are becoming minority-serving institutions. That's a federal designation and a federal and international, I would argue, responsibility. So they said, we need to really think about this on our Santa Barbara campus, but this will be what the system will be. And I still maintain that the University of California is the greatest university in the world. So I consider this designation an honor, but I consider it a call to action for my linguistics department in particular, but as a way and a model to show in real time how this work might be done with respect to discipline and institution. So many of these people are here in this room today who helped really start this conversation on that structural level to say, what are we doing with race intellectually and in action and in that intersection in linguistics? That led us to having a symposium a couple of years ago that led to further discussions that then led on to our statement on race. and the language paper that right now is in draft form online, and we're inviting responses to that paper. And Andre said we could extend the deadline, which I'm really happy about. So this whole talk is for you to think and then go home and write a plan, right? Help us make that plan. You have a tangible publication venue. Get with your friends. If you ain't got no friends, do it by yourself, right? But really think about this idea that a linguistics theory of race has to incorporate the perspective of linguistic researchers of different methodological approaches and racial backgrounds. But we say, most importantly, given our work, people in our neighboring disciplines. They are actually a lot of people of different racial groups who are heavily vested and heavily interested in language research. They just don't happen to be in our community in particular. So we need to start with the reality rather than starting with imaginary situations. And what we see is that how this has happened over time has weakened everyone's research. It's erased, it's marginalized, and misrepresented racially minoritized groups within our work, and it has diminished in the eyes of many scholars of color linguistics as a discipline. So we need to recognize that need for repair before we recognize that need for progress. Okay, so a racially just approach to doing this work asks deep questions about who is currently doing what research and why. And the first step for me has always been thinking about who is in your classes. Are they racially inclusive? Are they diverse? Are they seated in a curriculum where students from different backgrounds know about them, access them, and see them as important? And that's the tricky one. We have a new Mellon Foundation grant on humanizing humanities research at Santa Barbara, and the Mellon officer suggested that, we're breaking a taboo here. We need to be able to talk to students of color and say, not just that they should take linguistics is awesome, but how am I gonna get paid? What am I gonna do with this? And why is it relevant to anybody that I know in my whole world? All right? So in this way, people who are doing this work are examining issues of race and inclusion, but we are also really addressing tensions surrounding investigations of language and race and why they have been done in the previous incantations, and how we situate ourselves in the hierarchies of linguistics and who decides what's linguistics and what's going to get done and what's on our agenda cannot be evaded in this context. And so now, to extend the arguments that we even present in the race paper, so you have some new stuff to talk about when you go home and write your response. My argument is that we cannot anymore evade direct conversations about white supremacy in linguistics. Now, I grew up in the segregated South. I'm talking relatives with no indoor plumbing South. But because of my own background, understanding my own skin color and my own privilege, I understand why I'm at this podium today, and a lot of other people aren't. It started before slavery ended with the notion of free people of color. It started at emancipation and who was given goods and resources, including my ancestors who were given funding and support to build houses for newly freed enslaved people, that allow me to stand up here and talk about white supremacy from a position of privilege, but from a position of urgency. And what I've seen in linguistics is that racism is often couched in linguistics in pragmatic arguments about reputation, expenses, who's going to pay for this inclusion y'all talking about, and majority wishes, the way I say. Well, what is it that we want to do? And that often is also encouched in a notion of what would be good for the most people. So very majority dominant type narratives. What I want to do to counter those pragmatics is ask a question and have us really thinking and writing about who has power in linguistics and who sees that power and who makes decisions based on these issues of expenses, reputation, and majority wishes. Or is that power more diffuse than we really know? And so organization is the thing that might need to lead that power base. To give you some specifics about what I'm talking about, real questions about who edits journals, who runs the organization, Who decides the conference talks and themes and awards the NSF grants? And without specific answers to those questions, we won't be able to answer these broader issues of what kind of linguistics do we want for the future and for our students. So many of us, if you don't have large groups of minoritized or underrepresented students, you can evade some of these questions. But given the crew that we have at UC Santa Barbara and at some of my neighboring institutions, I have to think about this all day, and it's the thing that keeps me up at night. I think about this specifically with the respect that there are numbers of Black graduate students at UCSB, but also at Michigan, Stanford, there's others, at Ohio State in particular. And the specific question that I have to answer from the notion of linguistics and white supremacy is, where will they go next? And what are the structural, specific, and personal processes that will cause us to have an answer to that question? So how will this change what we do? Christine and I wrote about this in American Speech in a paper called Dismantling the Master's Tools, Moving Students Right to Their Own Language from Theory to Practice. And we set a set of particular questions that we have been engaging with individuals, departments, groups of people, and saying that one of the pathways that we can have to really addressing these structural issues is for everyone individually, but then in groups, to start off with conversations and answers to these questions. And we've been using them at UC Santa Barbara across the institution as well, as we really think about what would be our tangible evidences and artifacts of the notion of being the highest resourced minority serving institution in the United States. So we're thinking about syllabi here. We're thinking about taking really good data-enriched surveys and analysis about who's in our undergrad programs, our grad programs, but also who's not in there and why. Where our faculty are kind of doing their work informs that, but also our programming informs that as well. So exposure to diverse and meaningful experiences for our students that let them know about the changes that are happening in higher education at large and their responsibilities as undergraduates and graduate students and new faculty, as well as to just linguistics. So as I've thought about this work on the larger scale for the UC system, I've been thinking about how it plays out in particular for linguistics. And what we've come up with is a 3-stage model of addressing inclusion challenges in linguistics that responds to this everyday mantra for me of thinking about what does it mean to be a research university that is minority serving. So here are the 3 parts. And again, this is not in the article yet, so you can take a picture and then go home and write about it. The first is a STEM model. The STEM model of inclusion follows the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, and other inclusion models that says, look, I'm a scientist, I do what I do, right? We've all heard that in different incantations in linguistics and other places. And what NSF and NIH and other institutions have said is, great, you still gonna have other people with you when you do it, right? And this is the seed of thinking about this model of broadening participation. So we can do that, we can follow that model, and we can enact those practices and policies. The second one that I think now gets more particular to linguistics context is a racial value model. This emphasizes social justice and the intellectual values of scholars who are presently in linguistics from underrepresented groups. So it puts another layer of critical lens and narration on comments and responses to people to me who say things like, well, in my department, we just don't do socio. So then we have to be brave and think about what we do or say when we hear that, or we're also saying, well, we don't do Black people in this department because we know the majority of Black people do something related to socio. So now we're in this territory of structural exclusion and structural and intellectual supremacy. The way that I could see us kind of getting out of that quagmire relates to the third one. It's the most practical and the most expedient, and that's the partnership model. And the idea here is that on our campuses and in our intellectual space, we can work with neighboring disciplines and racial and ethnic gender and studies programs to create truly innovative interdisciplinary models that broaden our intellectual questions, at the same time contributing to questions that we see about language and culture and the nature of the language faculty and the mind in a broader space. So now I'm going to give you some specific examples of how we've been doing that and the type of intellectual work and material that has been coming from it. And we've been doing this in the model of what we call Talking College. It's a community-based language and racial identity development model for Black student justice. This team is large. It is funded in great respect from the University of California National Science Foundation, but also from many campuses who have sent us students for our summer research experience for undergrad program, as well as people who've been coming in and supporting it from all different angles. So the idea here is that this is a Black-centered project in terms of intellect and data that brings together faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students at UCSB with faculty and graduate students at other colleges and universities, but particularly historically Black colleges and universities. The summer program involves an introductory linguistics course that has a focus on language with respect to social mobility. And then we do interviews with students all around the country about their experience with their identity, their notions of Blackness, their ideas about language, and how that's pertained to their educational experience and the aspirations that they have for life after college and or graduate school. The findings from this program benefit students as well as the institutions they attend, because we have a direct feedback model involved in this. We're providing institutions and even other linguistics departments with information about the nature of the language of the culture of the Black students that attend, which has had direct implications for both teaching and mentoring. All right, so representing our HBCU crew here today, we have Chris Holt. Raise your hand. We couldn't bring every student, but we got Chris here. Chris attends North Carolina A&T University, the largest, right, and most fabulous HBCU in the country. And he worked with me on this address to get it right, not for this audience, but as we go on the road to HBCUs as well. And what we know is that you can't do a model of Blackness in any discipline, and our scholars in our STEM model have greatly recognized this, without conversations with HBCUs, because that is still where most Black people go to school. It's where they go to undergrad, it's where they graduate students, that's where they're faculty. I grew up thinking I would run one day. I still might, okay? So HBCUs continue to be a vital component in the education of minorities. And survival, I argue, of linguistics, especially our lens and our dedicated lines of research about African American language and culture, really can't continue in a good intellectual space if we're not having a conversation with HBCUs. And we are learning with students about their ideas about how language is structured and how these collaborations and our lens on the research that we've done in linguistics about African Americans, how does that make sense to HBCU students or not? What rings true methodologically, intellectually? You know, we joke. They can tell when a white person wrote it. We can also really think about this from what makes sense disciplinarity. So our students don't have linguistics. No HBCU has linguistics as a major, right? So our students are coming to us from speech and hearing. They're coming from education. They're coming from psychology. They're coming from English departments, communication departments, right? Places that make natural sense for our collaborations as scholars with people of color at our own universities. And I argue that in this model, they are truly leading the way. We are learning from them on the undergraduate level, but we are also learning on the graduate level. We have a National Science Foundation grant that brings together 4 minority-serving institutions in California, 2 from the UC system. That's Santa Barbara and Merced, the newest and most innovative in many ways universities in the country, and 2 from the Cal State system, Cal State Fresno and Cal State Channel Islands. And the question here, which I think is going to be great for what we've been doing as linguists in the future, Carol Giannetti and Carlos Nash, both linguists who are co-PIs on this grant with me, are asking the question, what do we have to change about our graduate teaching and graduate preparation, right, to make sure that we as linguists are serving not just the linguistics community, but everyone in the schools that we teach in. And so this grant focuses on pedagogical training and faculty career mentoring. And you've got an example of this work from Kendra Calhoun yesterday, who I heard people thought was a faculty member already, even though she's a graduate student, talking about her work in this AGEP model. Okay, so the idea here is we have to reset the frame, and we're doing it around pressing questions that already existed in linguistics. And so this is really what our students know we are all about. So one of our driving questions is really, how does the acquisition of different varieties of Black language and culture overlap with identity development, particularly intersectional racial identity development? And so to do that, in my grand historical Abovian tradition, we're doing a hell of a lot of interviews, right? So we're up to over 80 interviews already with Black students at MSIs. We have a whole nother summer to go. So our corpus is will probably be around 120, and then we've got dissertations and master's theses to follow. The idea is that we're also conducting ethnography. Students have been traveling all over the country. And we know that students face linguistic bias, but we're getting at the nature of it and the ways that they navigate it. So it goes back to the question, not just the question of what's happening to you, but it's what are you doing? What are you innovatively coming up with? What have you learned in your communities to cope with this, and how might linguists help in that journey? So we present themes and examples from these interviews that we'll do today. I'll show you some of them so you can kind of get a sense of that enriched kind of sense of nuance about the ways that we see students deserving this work, rather than just thinking it would be interesting or helpful. Our idea is that this work is for Black college students everywhere. And we've been submitting a plea nationwide for Black scholars in particular to share this work with their students, regardless of major. And it's not just for linguistics argument is our model. And one of the driving kind of quotes from that is from one of our students in our first cohort, Maya Hayes at Norfolk State University. After taking our intro course that Kendra talked about yesterday in terms of being a Black-centered or an HBCU-focused intro course, just looked at me and said, can you imagine if a lot of Black people knew about this, right? So this sense of urgency and deserving and feeling kind of left out of a conversation that's going on in elite spaces that's important and vital and relevant, news and information you can use. Why are we being left out? So when someone comes at me that way, I really think about it as personal. And I think about this as a linguistic justice issue. The specificity of who am I doing this for matters. So these are my 5 nibblings. And as I think about the first nibbling is at Stanford University right now. So Stanford got to debut this work. As we work to make undergrad ed more inclusive, we have to examine this idea of making our frameworks around language and linguistic justice that we do as linguists comprehensive so that they meet the daily needs of students. So our methodological processes are important. They must be relevant and they must be replicable. Now, I didn't think all of this up by myself. Our team is big, but it also spans generations. This work is a direct response to a request that my undergrad advisor, the late Cal Watkins, made for me for such work in my junior year at Harvard. And I made that sound nice. He was like, you should write about this for your thesis. And I was like, no. I'm gonna do something else right now. So I did that. I never even published that work. He was right. You should listen to people. He believed that a comprehensive examination of how African American students lived and learned on college campuses would answer long-standing questions about the nature of the linguistic idiolect in individuals, but also the situational stance of how to best support African American students, particularly as they come through elite universities, as we often do, one by one in every 5 to 10 to 15 years, right? So it's a particular question. And that would shed light as on a whole on the mobility situation of African Americans and the steps that we would need to make linguistics more just. So we can't academically and intellectually answer these questions in this comprehensive model, you'll see, and without getting our own houses in order. And that's why we've been focusing so much, Christine and I and our whole teams, about inclusion in linguistics, because we can't get the model right if we don't do that. Our model won't make sense. So we have to think about our own practices and policies if we want the linguistic information that we so desperately want to share and build upon to have any sense, particularly from underrepresented and Black students who know that there is a brutal truth. Baldwin told us this brutal truth. The bulk of white people in America never had any interest in educating Black people, except as this could serve white purposes. And we all should think about that part, not just the language part that follows, right? It's not the Black child's language that's in question. It's not the language that's despised, it's the experience. So I can't come in as a linguist and tell you I've got all this crucial information to share and linguistics is awesome if they look at this room and they don't see people of color in it. Because Baldwin told us a child cannot be taught by anyone who despises them. And a child cannot afford to be fooled. A child cannot repudiate their experience and all that gives them sustenance and enter limbo in which they will no longer be Black, in which they know they'll never be white. Black people have lost too many Black children that way. All right? So that brutal truth rings true here. There's a recurrent narrative in linguistics whereby people warn students about prestige, the need for prestige in the schools they attend and teach, and the need for prestige in the subfields that they study. And I get it. I have been a linguist my whole life. But what we need to understand is that form of white supremacy couched in the rhetoric of academic pragmatics is harmful, and it doesn't make sense to the students in our program. I'm an endowed professor now, safe as the sun, and we're gonna come for you in my particularly scholarly and graceful way. Because if linguistics wants to be inclusive, it's gonna be through finding ways to merge with the social and intellectual interests with people of color, not by telling us what we should be studying and what we should be doing. To hark back to Baldwin, my Black ass is way too smart for that. All right? So this is personal for me. I get tons of suggestions my whole career that have been well-meaning, and I get them. And some people just ask, why don't you just go do education? But I'm gonna give you a structural argument for that hasn't really been in the conversation as much in these halls, is that cuts me out of an arts and science discourse of higher education. Most schools of education, and that's changing right now, but most have been graduate schools, right, where you are teaching graduate students. The bulk of people, particularly underrepresented people, get 2-year or 4-year undergraduate degrees. And so this is a place where I argue we shouldn't look at this as a follow. We should look at this as a lead. We should be thinking about this not with respect to who does socio or who does what, but who are the decision makers in higher education in the years to come. Now, Jamal's over there shaking his head because we have to think about this every day, because Jamal in our lab is the UC student regent and represents the entire student population of the UC in every policy meeting that we have. It's a full-time job, and it's informing our work in the most serious levels. Okay, so I want to just give a shout out to the deeper discussions that we had about this type of conversation yesterday at the Black Becoming panel, where people were emotionally brave, they were intellectually brave, they were doing racial work, but they were also doing something far greater, I would argue, for our discipline. They were setting a course for our conversations about us as professionals and as whole people that need to be in the literature more fully in linguistics for this to really work, okay? And this is on the obvious. We know that professors can hold negative linguistic attitudes. Students have reported that, and Stephanie Dunstan in particular and her team has done great work in bringing those conversations to the student affairs and higher education community. And so what we are doing to follow is really thinking about those key interview and key questions that can build on that message and make sense from an underrepresented lens. So I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit here just because I wanna spend some time on this. So we're asking students about their experiences linguistically, but we're also asking them about how that relates to choosing their major, how this is important to the work that they're doing, and their experiences with bias and discrimination at large, as well as those that they think are linguistics related. Our important piece of this is to then show how this all relates to our responsibilities as linguists in the broader university and informs our teaching, our practice, and research. So Christine, Becky Childs, who's here, and Philip Carter, who's in Fiji, he has better sense than all of us, really got together and started thinking about this, particularly as we kind of moved up in our careers and thought about the administrative and intellectual roles we're going to have as department chairs and center directors and college undergrad administrators. And we want to do a real nod to Spoken Soul, to John Rickford, and really thinking about, he laid a lot of that conversation out for students in text. So what we really see our work doing now is that updating this work. And students who have read the book and have even been in this conversation have said, you know, when they read Spoken Soul, they only had a surface knowledge of what's going on. But understanding the use of African American English and its connections to all aspects of life is really the direction that we're working to go in. So we have to give a nod to what students deserve to know from well-established linguistics. That's the LSA type, but also authors across the spectrum of Black scholars who engage in language, particularly the students' right to their own language statement from the National Councils of Teachers of English and the critical source book by Stacey Perryman Clark, David Kirkland, and Austin Jackson that update that notion for a modern audience. Okay, so I'm going to focus now on some key messages that we think we have to really work together to get out to all Black students. Language is culture. So your language is your Black, and your Black is your beautiful. So that extends our linguistic message to one that is more seated in a Black studies and a Black kind of cultural rhetoric. All languages have value. That's the linguistic mantra we've had. But what we're extending in this student development model is your language is not broken, and neither are you. Right? So hearing this all together is the really important part. You know, I'm all about inherent variation, so that's going to be part of it. Students deserve to know how language varies internally and externally, and really understanding those linguistic processes, because that really helps them understand and get to the more nuanced ideas about mutual intelligibility. How we can understand each other somewhat, but without prior familiarity or special effort. But that may be different depending on your background, your language, your race, your culture, your stance on the world. And the biggest question I've got, and those are more general messages that we as linguists all tend to preserve, but the biggest question I've got from Black scholars in particular is, why does African American English, despite all the stigma, despite all the degradation, still exist? And one of the things that we have really been successful in help people understand from a linguistic stance is because we use language to preserve meaning. Okay, so this idea of meaning, this idea of full expression of the self, the Black self, has resonated in terms of this deserving model with Black students. And that's particularly important because our main overarching deserving model is that the language of Black activism is powerful beyond measure. And the impact of your communication has the power to change your experience. Extending that in our work now is the idea that your Black does not have to sound or look like mine. And we are quick to acknowledge to people who we work with on these concepts that research in linguistics has not fully reflected those facts. It's mostly been a binary, Black, white, or other group-facing model. And so the most important academic work that we have to do with these conversations as we bring these linguistic notions to greater populations is to think about, when we have a more fully inclusive linguistics, a more fully inclusive and Black-centered research model, how will this impact college students' experiences? So where do our students hear, see, and feel themselves in this work? And to do that, we built a dissemination model. Okay, Something that this is from an interview, but it's been resonated by many of the students I've taught over the past 20 years. I have always been curious about the origins of African American English and how it has developed over time. As an African American growing up in a predominantly white area, most of my exposure to African American English as a kid came from my family and the media, as opposed to my peers. And I believe it's important to fully understand African American English as an important part of African American culture. So my argument is this is the reality for most students who've had the privilege or opportunity to be in an African American linguistics course because of where we teach them right now. Predominantly white institutions, many of them who are highly resourced, who have linguistics programs or departments. But that has also been the lens then that has informed the conversation and not included students who don't have that. So key to this model is the recognition is that when Black students in that environment and in others get to college, they find new freedoms in some aspects due to how college is set up. But their peers, both their white peers and their Black peers, bring a whole new set of social constructs and pressures. So you will see that through the data that we have here. So we're thinking about this acquisition model. How does it overlap with identity and race? How does racial and linguistic development overlap with gender identification, sexual orientation, social class, and other identities that students intersectionally navigate in college? And how does linguistic insights, which operate really differently in groups, really inform our ideas about what race is and how race plays out in language? For example, me personally, I may want to sound Black all day, but my K-12 experience has rendered me sounding a little white, I know, whether I wanted to or not. And so it makes me think about my own choices about racial identity and gender performance. And so based on these interviews, all 80 of them, we have come up with a language and racial identity development model. So there are different prongs to the model. I'm going to give you some data examples here. You can ask me more in the Q&A and read all about it in about a couple months. So the model involves a couple different forms of students. And the idea is that we work with this model with Black students and they see themselves in the model, or they don't, and they tell us. Students who speak African American English and are still grappling with standardized English, and they know it. Students who speak African American English all day, every day, and are what we call unbothered. Students who are amazing users of African American English and are amazing at standardized English too, and they come in different identity models, as you'll see. Students who speak standardized English and speak some African American English or understand it. Students who speak standardized English and know African American English, but ain't really trying to admit it. Respect. And students who speak standardized English and don't know African American English, and they may know that or not. Okay, so how did we arrive at this through our data and our ethnographies? I'll give you some examples of that here. Okay. Students who speak African American English and are still grappling with standardized English and know it. These students know about language variation and linguistic concepts, but you know what? They're trying to be more successful in college. Their concepts of Blackness may vary, as they may not be aware about the links between language, culture, and race. And they may sound more white relative to other people in their community, but they may sound really Black to others. And a student at a community college in the West had something to say about this type of the model. I try to tell them I speak in a certain way to demonstrate that I can transfer. Because listen to me, right? So they are using their linguistic variation very strategically to be identified in the group of Black students at community college who'll be eligible for that 4-year consideration. So this is this mobility racial model in action. Students who speak African American English and are still grappling with standardized English, and they might not know exactly what's going on either way. So the concept of African American English is new to them, and they think that they're just bad at language overall, and they have been maybe told this consistently throughout their K-12 and college education because variation is a new concept for them. And their concept of Blackness, we found in these students, may be very pronounced. So best examples of this, students who come up with this model, and this is an example from a specific student, but over and over we've got this in the data. We may be sharing different linguistic features or aspects of African American English, and they just look at us and say, oh wait, that's African American English, right? Not something else. I didn't know if it was nothing, bad English, or it could just be standardized English, kind of in the discourses that we find. Students who speak African American English and are unbothered. Students who are proud of their language and often oppositional to dominant structures. College for them is about getting paper, not assimilation to a dominant norm. So I mean paper diploma and paper money. Their concept of their blackness may be pretty pronounced. So this is from an interview from a student who kind of is in this stance. Someone who believes in the politics of academia, or someone who believes this is gonna change my life, talking about learning standardized English or speaking it. This is gonna help the world, you know what I'm saying? Those who are invested in the politics of academia in its fullest sense. Yes, if I were that person, I would say, yes, I do have to change how I speak or how I look or whatever. But they're gonna treat me like a nigga regardless. So I might as well act, I'm sorry, they're gonna treat me like a black regardless. So it's just like, why do the most? I'm literally sitting here having to like shove myself into a box. For what? Like they're still gonna see my bald black head and be like, look at this bitch. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. Okay, so this is the idea that just because someone tries to act accordingly or completely shift their linguistic information, students have realized this may be, in Baldwin's sense, a game. To me personally, and that's just because I think in high school, and I tried for like 1 year to act accordingly or speak accordingly to what people think is correct, which is just how white people speak. And then I realized it really doesn't make a difference, at least in my experience. So I don't think I have to. When I write essays, do I write grammatically correct? Sure. But you know what I'm saying? So that was a student at a predominantly white institution in the Southeast, and you can see, right, that kind of paradox even within her own interview as she thinks about language in the written and the spoken form. Student at a PWI in the Southeast, coming at this from another model. I've noticed some microaggressions. I remember I was talking about black women, and it was in my women and gender studies class, and I was doing a research paper. So I was talking about that, and I said, finna. And this other girl, this white girl, she said, like, finna? What is that? What does that mean? And I was looking at her like, I know good and well, you attend a university within North Carolina, which is the South. You cannot tell me that you have never heard the word finna. There was no reason for you to say that in front of the whole class, right? So really looking at that linguistic power dynamic that can be used or weaponized even in a classroom situation, student to student, and across racial, but sometimes an intraracial aspect. Okay, students who are amazing users of African American English and are amazing at standardized English. As such, students often hold positions of prominence on college campuses because of their self-presentation. They are academic, but they keep it real. Their concept of blackness may be pretty pronounced, but it may be pronounced in ways that are particularly appealing to the mainstream or leadership of the campus. That's all of us who are on the front of the websites, the campus videos, and brochures, okay? So here's y'all been that person, stop playing. Okay, so here's a student from the Southeast talking about that. I read a Bible passage at my grandma's funeral, and after I read that, and people were just coming up to me, were like, oh my gosh, you read so well, and you speak with a lot of intelligence and blah, blah. And I'm like, were you not expecting me to read with proficiency? That was really weird for me, because I would always think like, well, what is their expectation of somebody that looks like me? Am I supposed to speak a certain way? Is there only one right way to speak? Right? So these are narratives that we know are persistent in popular culture and in Black popular culture, but the linguistic interchange that we can so crucially have in those conversations, if we are present and they are present in our discussion, will richly fill out the notion of how these racialized situations kind of manifest in particular speech acts. Okay? And we see this happening in HBCU context. And we think about this in terms of students who speak standardized English and may know African American English, but what we say is they really ain't trying to admit it. And some students don't know like what is what. It's not really kind of been the context or the frame that they've been thinking about it, but they may have a pronounced sense of blackness, but their language use, we see, may be divorced from that narrative. So an interview with an HBCU student at an Eastern Public University kind of shares this model. Only our TA spoke African American English, but she a person still learning to become a teacher, but it was still our favorite class, right? So they, in a sense, have a sense of, in their all-Black context, their teachers using some African American English, but they think by the time she graduates, she might have to figure that out. They like her anyway. All right, so we have a lot to work there. Okay, students who speak standardized English and don't know African American English. And some of these students are from the Black diaspora, and others are learners of African American English themselves. And so we've seen this in a couple different contexts. And one student who's a graduate student from the Black diaspora in the Northeast shared, I haven't always been comfortable with my voice as I am now. I think if you had interviewed me right out of college, I don't know if I would say the same things that I'm saying right now. I think the biggest ways it affected me is it made me feel like those people are not safe. If you see I hold these type of opinions that minimize or delegitimize my experience as a Black person or as a Black person, and I'm not going to feel comfortable developing a relationship with you in which I can share the challenges I face. Like, I'm not going to talk to you about why it's so difficult for me to feel like I have to prove myself in every classroom. Because I'm one or two in a lot of situations of people being that Black woman in these spaces. And I know I'm being judged for how I look and how I talk and how I dress and my research agenda and my methodology, right? So this is what's really important for us, is to include a developmental aspect for this, and understanding that Blackness is something that varies, but also develops. It can be taught in a way that's detrimental, and it can be taught in a way that's empowering. It can be taught in a way that shares individuality and isolates, particularly in graduate school settings, or it can be done in a way that empowers the collective. And so that's why it's so important for us to think about this as a dialogic model. And what we need to do next is really think about how are we doing these conversations even within our linguistic presentation of this information so far that speaks to the racial and cultural identity and not just the linguistic knowledge that we're sharing with the population. And we think that if we get this a little bit more kind of developed within linguistics, our message will resonate more strongly and more efficiently with greater numbers of people of color. And then with that knowledge, we can better support students in higher education from the range of Black experiences, and then tailor our teaching in African American English courses, but in all of linguistics to those student populations. So a little bit now on conclusions and further directions. My argument is that linguistics, but not just linguistics, all of academia is just beginning to fully describe the African American experience, both academically and intellectually. And the programs and pathways that we are working on and we've been doing for Black students to be involved in our work, this is at HBCUs, it's in prisons, it's everywhere, it's critical to our thick, rich linguistic and cultural description. So I want you to think about the information that I've shared with you today, and I want you to think specifically about how you could yourself share this information with someone. And how could this information not only serve to give them linguistic fodder or linguistic context, but to make their diaspora seem real and more whole. And important for me is being able to do this type of work, to share it, to present it, and to publish it. And we have teaching linguistics and we have teaching American speech, but it's great to see this. It would be great to see places and spaces for this type of culturally and racially seeded work in linguistic journals across the board. So what do? My time is up. You've heard a lot, but you don't have to do it all. You need to find your allies, other faculty, administrators, resources at your institution. You might want to pick one of my approaches to start. If NSF STEM is where you are, go get the NSF money. If you are listening to current members of your department and from underrepresented communities that's on your campus and other places, you want to be careful not to burden them. So what is the work that you will do in this action is important. And then if you are calling on your colleagues to help you get it right, do something new, innovative, try something that we haven't even thought of before. We want to find ways to materially recognize those contributions. Okay, to me, this is how we will comprehensively think the children of the 9th Ward, circa 2005. I filed my dissertation in August, and Katrina hit the next month. And so I've been thinking about this specifically, and I'm excited to say that Adrienne Dowden, who's here today, is now doing her EDD at Xavier University on African American language and culture. So the tangible, material relationships that we form and build when we do this work will make this honor be authentic and real. So I'm going to say thanks here to Christine, to Mary Buchholz, the entire Talking College crew, the National Science Foundation Awards that make the work possible, the North Hall Endowment at UC Santa Barbara, people who really helped get it off the ground at HBCUs, at Emory, and particularly The Ohio State University that came correct with all this work, and everyone who's invited me at their campus recently to bravely engage in this work. I never thought I'd lead an MIT faculty meeting, but that shit actually happened. Okay, questions? Both with that, and that's a great question. So we are presenting the model to students now that we have it more developed and asking them where they see themselves in it, where it doesn't make sense to them, do they agree with the category or not. But a lot of our early interviews we use to kind of draw those themes out through codes. So a lot of our grad students, they're sitting there in a row, have particular projects, undergrad theses, undergrad theses, master's theses, and doctoral dissertations, where they're delving more deeply into that and thinking about in their interviews and they're finding in those relationships how they relate that. So we're using both sociolinguistic interview kind of technique with that, ethnography, but it's seated in that community-based model where the students are developing the model and are part of that data information as it grows. So our researchers are just as important, our student, in developing the model as then someone who we would frame as like a research participant. Great.
All right, thank you for the talk. I assume we're just supposed to walk up here.
Yeah, you can walk up.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, I guess the thing that I wanted to say is that it's really interesting looking at some of the approaches that you take to, I guess, humanizing the culture language aspect. And I wish, I'm just like, where was this talk when I was teaching linguistics, introductory linguistics for educators in the Oakland School District with students who had been students during the Oakland Ebonics controversy, and I was younger than them. So I'm just really grateful for this talk because I might end up in a situation like that again, and now I actually have something. But my actual question and not comment is more related to graduate students, because they're in this really weird in-between zone where on the one hand, they are the students that the faculty is supposed to be interacting with and catering to, but on the other hand, they are the instructors of students. Who write reviews and evaluations, and they don't have to, the students who are writing the evaluations don't have to go through these types of sensitivity trainings that we have to go through. And just what is your advice to those graduate students? Because I've seen stuff where someone will write an evaluation, somebody gets excited about it, runs around, shows all of the other grad students, hey look, somebody wrote, this person is X, Y, and Z nationality. What's not to love about them? And I'm standing there like, no one's gonna write that about me because I'm Black. Yeah. Like, how do you then take that and then apply for jobs?
Great. So one thing that you said is valuing the question, right? So part of our NSF model is developing whole different types of graduate courses, which is what we're involved in at Santa Barbara right now. So we teach students how to do this in process. So all next year I'll be doing one on scholarship of teaching and learning, developing materials. But to answer your question directly and specifically, is you have to, in that model, we have to prepare our graduate students to receive the evaluations and advocate for themselves in that evaluation process. And that's something that can be done proactively rather than reactively. So one of the best ways to do that proactively is to advocate in every department and program on the graduate and the faculty level for multiple modes of evaluation of teaching. So right now, a lot of schools rely heavily on student evaluations and or some kind of esteem of an observer or a chair. But what we want to argue is that you also have a teaching philosophy that's part of that evaluation process, that syllabi and course materials, including student artifacts, grading, you can tell I've been on assessment teams for the university, are part of that, and that when you do then have to react to a negative or kind of weird evaluation, that you have data from those other proactive sources that allow you to respond to it more than even just saying that the reality of that person may be biased in some way, but you can show the teaching kind of impact. And I've had to do that myself. My first job was at the College of William & Mary. That's a purple state, but a lot of my students were red. And they didn't want me as their teacher, right? So I had to kind of develop that coming from a more situation where that hadn't really had come up in conversations in linguistics departments that I've been in, to not just address student comments, but to show academically and intellectually the merit of the teaching that I was doing. And that's gonna be a safer way of doing it than trying to do it in crisis mode, is what I'm arguing. Because in crisis mode, it's always just, they said whatever on the eval versus what I say. But setting that up within that scholarship of teaching and learning just allows that to be one more comment, or one more source of data. Good question. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hudley, for such an interesting approach to African Americans in linguistics. I am a faculty at an HBCU, and in your models, I did not see how we win over administrators.
You got it. That's next.
That is a real problem.
They only gave me 45 minutes, but our next grant, which will go in next week, is a faculty-centered grant. It has faculty, as senior faculty at Santa Barbara, Baltimore County, where Christine is, The Ohio State University, MIT, Berkeley, Michigan, Howard, Hampton, and North Carolina A&T. And that entire grant is designed to figure out this question of how to win over administrators structurally for curricular inclusion, but also in the research paradigms will then allow the teaching down the road to happen. And so we're gonna start with that group of schools and hopefully work it out. We're gonna do data interviews of Black faculty, their own linguistic experiences and their intellectual experiences. We're gonna do a faculty learning community for a year, really thinking about and talking to people at different institutions. People are lined up. Some of the ones that will go to FAMU for sure, Jackson State for sure, have conversations about inclusion on those campuses and curricular. Virginia State has been helping us from the beginning, kind of leading this way. We've already appealed to the state of Virginia for them to get more linguistics, right, funding, because it's not just administrators, it's for a lot of the HBCUs, it's working with the state on the funding allocation. And then we'll hope by then we'll scratch the surface and then be able to grow that grant, which we kind of see as a pilot, into a larger conversation. Based out of that, Christine and I spend most of our days these days actually as administrators. We know from critical race theory there's some interest convergence there, but we think at the end of the day, practically, it's gonna be grant, from what we've seen and doing this work, is it's gonna be grant writing that's gonna seed our interests in the beginning. So figuring out for us right now with Virginia State, what we did is that we had Kendra go and be faculty in residence as a graduate student. So Kendra lived in the Honors College. She worked there as a fellow. She taught amazing and brilliantly. She's researching with us, but allowed her to have a semester of on-the-ground conversations with administrators and faculty at Virginia State to kind of see the need for this, not just as, oh, you need a linguistics department or program, but classes, integration of this work, as she co-taught with their chair of English in his history of English class, really critiquing and thinking about what should be in the existing curriculum.
Okay, our situation is very unique in the sense that I heard you mention earlier in your talk that there were no programs in linguistics in HBCUs. We are unique in the sense that we have an MA program in linguistics. We offered several degrees for several years. Then, because I'm not talking about departmental administrators, I'm talking about upper administrators, deans, vice presidents, who saw no interest in this regardless to how much we fought. So when there came a program review, our program was suspended.
Got it. That's what we see.
It is an MA in linguistics. For a while, they had MA in English with emphasis in linguistics. So now it's just in the catalog, but no majors.
Yes, that's what
now we're down to one faculty in linguistics. You cannot run a program with one faculty. The problem is that when we had faculty, you could not get them to hear. We had to have 25 or 30 people in a class of linguistics, and we know that all over the country, those classes do not multiply for majors in the upper levels as do in other curriculums. So we find, they say they don't have money, but they are still hiring British American lit faculty, African American lit faculty, nobody in linguistics. So when you come up with a model that will help us to reactivate our program, we are ready to go.
And I do think that why we made this model kind of collective, what has the MLA done and the College Linguists Association, what have some other disciplines done is the organizations have stood up for departments and programs and faculty. That's something that we as an organization at the LSA can do to help seed those conversations on the campus level, but also on that state and political level. Right? So we stand for linguistics at Santa Barbara, but Jamal goes into meetings at the Regents and to our president and stands for linguistics and Black students throughout the system. And I think when, as you said, several HBCUs had programs and those dwindled, I think we lost a critical moment there, and so the best we can do is try to come in again and kind of do some of that repair. Yep. Thank you so much for sharing. The questions.
Thank you so much. This was a really important talk, and I'm really excited to see this kind of work at a plenary address at the LSA. And I really want to specifically thank you for talking about professional and institutional sort of structures that I think there's a sort of tradition of these happening in whisper networks and closed-door meetings and getting transmitted from one advisor to one grad student. And so having it out in the open and on the slides and in the big room is really important, and I'm really, really grateful. And I have a question about how this sort of, your conversation has been very within higher education, and I think that that's the world that we live in. You know, we're here as a professional organization of scholars and educators, but we're also living in this economic system that is leeching money out of the higher education institutions. And so I am both inspired and excited by your discussion of like grant getting and funding distribution and administrator arm twisting, but I'm also worried, and I wonder if you could speak to this, about how we as sort of a professional organization of scholars can work to rearrange the money back into higher education in a way that serves minoritized scholars and sort of revitalizes the field.
So the direct responses, I think that's where I joke about it, but the NSF STEM model can work. I think we're gonna have to be more strategic as a discipline about our partnerships and relationships with faculty and groups, and that can be even disciplines that have not lost their money streams, right? So for me to get this AGEP grant was huge, but it means I'm really formatively working with my colleagues in physics and engineering, right? The things on campus that can allow my conversation to go and give me the infrastructure to even do it. And I think that just realistically at this point has to be part of it. But I think that's what then ties into that disciplinary partnership model, is that we have to really think critically about our departments that do enroll larger numbers of students and how we can have partnerships with those departments that kind of get us safer on the board. Best thing that ever happened to me in getting that lens is I started off as a linguist in the English department. English departments are dwindling, but they're not going away or kind of as small. So I didn't really have to worry in the same way about us meeting classes. We actually expanded, as you all know, we married quite largely through those excuse me. One second. Through those collaborations, I'm losing my voice. But we haven't had a disciplinary kind of approach to that, which I think will help. It'll settle down. Yeah.
And I'm overwhelmed by the breadth and depth of the activism and pro-emancipation for language users who have been traditionally stigmatized. I also appreciate your framing all of these issues within what's basically an institutionalized white supremacist racist system. And often we want to be cordial, I'll use that word, but I'm so glad that you went ahead and called things what they are, because that's the framework that we're dealing with. One of our colleagues just mentioned the stonewalling of the administration in acting on these issues and how difficult it was. But once we place it in the institutionally white supremacist and racist and classist and all of those other things, once we place it within that framework, we can begin to see very, very clearly, and that's so important, seeing clearly what you're dealing with, the level to which it is entrenched, and that it's all about the S concept, and the S concept is struggle. And at the end of the day, we see that, of course, the higher administrations are working within a particular kind of system and structure. So we're going to have those obstacles. And we need the conceptual and activist baggage to deal with that and to take it down. I really don't have the words to express my admiration for what you have put together. So I can only say go forward with it. And you know what? I also appreciate your use of African American rhetorical strategies in your talk. So thanks.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Arthur. Sorry, I've had a cold the last couple weeks. I think what's important about naming and categorizing this work is that to address a structure, we know, and any of us who grew up in the South, I mean, my parents were civil rights activists of the first degree. They sued everywhere they worked and everywhere we lived. So I have no fear on those things. You have to make a strategy. And so a lot of the things that we're talking about that we want to deal with, we have to name them because we have to get an articulated strategy, because we know from the history of those people who put their lives on the line to integrate schools and businesses and hospitals that you can't do it alone. So throwing one Black linguist into a department or to an organization, there's just no way to kind of deal with that. There's no way for one person to save a department or to argue for classes that are being cut. It has to be a group that has a mission and that won't let people evade the issues at hand, right? So nothing new under the sun, but a little new to linguistics is kind of the model that we're arguing. Sure.
First of all, I want to say thank you for starting off here in New Orleans with your project, because it has definitely informed what we were doing in the classroom. And I wanted to say that as an educator, I've learned so much. Looking at linguistics, it was never a course in my undergrad. It was never a course in my graduate level. And now that I'm working on my doctorate, it's still not part of that. However, it has a big impact on what we do in the classrooms. And so I know we're talking about systems and how we can inform things that are going on at the college level. I want to know, in which direction are you thinking that we can go to get more linguistic-like classes into the educational settings that our teachers are going to, because our students need that. And our students are suffering, and I see it every day, you know, what's going on in the classrooms, especially in our English classes, and the grading systems and the degradation that they're receiving, and it's just heartbreaking. So my question is, what can we do?
Well, I think, you know, as you know, we started off with our little ones, right? K through 1, 2, and how do we end up at college and higher ed? It's we have to interrogate directly the practices that are going on in schools of education. We can't go in and necessarily change like the whole curriculum, but I think at this point we have to do, as we're trying to do with our next grant model, a one-to-one conversation of figure out which class, which course, which professor is going to integrate some of this. And in that Southern activist tradition, you got to go school to school, one by one, and secure the place, right? So publication is just the start. It's the action of, okay, who's gonna read what article, who's gonna do what talk, what materials are gonna be used at Xavier. Okay, who's gonna do UNO? Okay, let's go on over to Mississippi. What's going on at Jackson State? And make that articulate. And that's the model that we're working on now, which hopefully in a couple years we'll present, that'll make it kind of make sense from an activist standpoint. The idea there is then that way we're not going teacher to teacher and each kid to each kid, but we can at least have a curricular sweep at the beginning of that. Because we've been working together now for what, 20 years?
20 years.
We kind of get tired after a while of just going school to school, although we never give up with that. I keep telling people, the biggest talk I've ever given was to you and New Orleans teachers. How many people did we get in that room? It was almost 1,000, right?
Yes, it was.
Right. So we don't want to underscore the importance of those type of district and union-sponsored events that at least get the conversation going. Right. But we need to move out of that sense of repair into one of kind of education action.
Right. And as you know, after Katrina, we were all dispersed, so right?
Yes.
So it's like now starting again over from ground zero.
Absolutely.
But again, thank you, and we appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. So I'm faculty at NYU, and I'm not American. So when I arrived here, I felt like I was just naive to a lot of the specifics of, you know, race and culture in America. Coming from Canada, of course, it's not wildly different. But for example, I didn't really know much about HBCUs, and but yet I'm on admission committees and job search committees. And so you mentioned earlier about, you know, not just national but international, and of course all these systemic things are all over. But maybe just if you could speak a bit about, you know, for a foreigner like me, a semi-foreigner, representing an American university abroad, and you know, and also having to, you know, sitting on all these committees where we're deciding things about students both nationally and internationally, and I want them to kind of know about, you know, the issues that we face specific to the US, but also internationally. So if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I think that's where this graduate education component becomes really important, because we need to think about, as we think about inclusion work, it has to become not just conversations or workshops, but be part of our curriculum. So it's more of a question of, you know, the topic may be syntax or it may be a phonetics class, but integrating more information either in the class or in our curriculums as a whole that will seek to make sure that our students have this information as part of them thinking about being professional academics, linguists, but that we are learning with them as that happens, right? So that, I think, is a more strategic way of starting this, because we're all learning about different groups and different situations as we go along. That's what's so interesting for me doing this work now at a Hispanic serving institution. I'm learning a lot, right? As we go through, And I'm learning it from my students, I'm learning it from my reading, I'm learning it from other scholars, but building it around that intellectual frame of what does it mean to be a linguist, a professional linguist, either in academia or in industry, that these are things you need to do to be a good person, citizen, and scholar, professional, that they're curricular, they're academic, and they're important. I'd rather do that way structurally so that then we can say, okay, we're in this meeting and we're talking about admissions and we're talking about someone's particular situation. Oh yeah, you remember this thing we read or this thing that we have all, kind of done our own plans on, right? So encourage our students have to write and really think about their own curricular inclusion plans. That gives a much better starting place and a much more systemic place than kind of being in that situation, not knowing what to do, which is where we find ourselves a lot, and not really knowing where to go from there. But it also can do something that's really important. It can defray the direct conflict and the power dynamics that would come up. Because most people at the end of the day who get to make the decisions will be senior. And so you gotta have a strategy to go with that or against that in the way that higher ed is set up.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we got like 2 minutes for questions, I think. We're over. If you gotta go, go. Some of y'all need to pee before the next session. I'm all right with that.
I can give a 2-minute, it won't be a 2-minute question. I loved what you were just saying about learning. I think that's the right frame. And especially when you're approaching people with power, right? Needing to invite vulnerability and that, someone with power may need to learn some things or two. So I guess I just wanted to celebrate that. And thank you for such an inspiring and strategically oriented way forward.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.